Hi everyone, my name is Maxwell Bland. I've been working on operating system exploits for many, many years, and then I joined Motorola, I think it was like 2.5, 3 years ago, started working on kernel protection more generally, learned some stuff, found some stuff, wrote some stuff, but this talk is not actually about me, this talk is about Linux. So it's kind of funny in preparation for this talk, I was thinking of an exploit I saw this year in a certain company's proprietary driver for the kernel that looked a little bit something like this, which I'll save you the having to parse this, is two uint32 types being multiplied together and then passed as a parameter to a uint32 type, which turned out to be a bit of a problem. Now patched, thankfully. So kind of working from this basic concept of you have a buffer overflow or use after free or standard software exploits, I wanted to have us all discuss a little bit today, if you want to join me, about general write gadget exploits. Thinking of write gadget as you control an address and a value inside the kernel. And what could you do with that? Of course, a lot of time this looks like a use after free. And there's been a lot of work over the past couple of, almost a decade now, on protecting static data resources. So things like .text, .read-only data, locking down those. So this talk does require a sort of pre-game for your particular product or interest of choice where you have to do a lot of legwork that I've done over the past 2 years, and I think a lot of people at a lot of organizations have looked into and done, which is verifying or monitoring page table updates. I know there's recent commits from ARM for the permission overlay extension, or at least submitted patches to the mailing list. But you really have to kind of solve these problems with just static data or like system control registers, right? Translation table base register 0, remapping memory, or in ARM, the just general translation control register. First, today's roundtable is not actually about solving all the static data stuff. There's lots of discussion on the mailing list, lots of papers on it already. Today's talk is about the more than 20,000 other data structures in the data section that are mutated during the kernel's runtime and life. So if you look around for proof of concept, full stack, full exploit chains for, say, Android phones, which I work on a day-to-day basis, you'll see sort of modifications to the file operations pointer inside struct file, which points to, of course, open and read and write. Now, protecting these data structures, I think, is somewhat more difficult than the static ones. With the static ones, you can determine for every code page what the struct static keys or jump label possibilities are. But for something like FOP, there's a handful of different places where it gets modified throughout the kernel to typically constant values, and then those are dispersed across a couple different drivers that you may or may not actually be using at all, as well as core kernel methods. And additionally, I've sort of, since joining Motorola, seen the lengths to which people are willing to go. We've been sent videos of people actually taking the steps to perform these sort of data-only attacks and very fine-grained manipulations to kernel resources. And this is all not to mention sort of CVE exploitability, lifetime, patch application delays, typical business. So going back a little bit, that's my spiel, my initial just background. If you've never heard of data-only exploits, what are these? I wanted to also pass around microphones for the next couple of slides because I'm going to just present a smorgasbord of what's been done. Case mentioned earlier ARM MTE, and there's many others. Many of the companies that people here in this room work at have presented mitigations for data-only attacks. So I wanted to go over a smorgasbord of what those mitigations are, what current preventions look like, and then hopefully get out of the way and stand at this round table. I don't think we'll all fit at this round table. And then plan and get opinions. I will share my opinions on what I think is the best way to deal with data-only attacks or manipulations to mutable data within the kernel. But I'd like to hear your opinions as well. So at any point, raise your hand. I will pass you a microphone. Feel free to jump in and mention things. And then there will be an open section at the end where I'll also pass around microphones. A VA has asked me to put the microphone here, not over here while you're talking. But yeah. And let me make this full screen. I apologize. Okay, so really quickly, running down the smorgasbord because we don't have a ton of time. Like the big ones that are in the kernel today that we already see projects like Graphene OS adopting to various degrees are ranstruct and ASLR. And I think that these sort of basic randomization approaches are kind of awesome because they at least make adversaries scan memory. Right? That's why I have a video saved somewhere on my computer of someone trying to dump out memory so they can find the randomization offset of the kernel so that they can then stage the next part of their exploit. The second one, which Case mentioned, is ARM-MTE or other hardware data flow integrity and tagging systems. One of the things, if you look at the literature on ARM-MTE or sort of the history of it, which many of you may be familiar with, is that people get really in depth with this stuff. So TMDFI, of course, is the RISC-V variant, but it goes so far as to try to perform full data flow integrity for modifications to data structures in the kernel. And then I've seen in reading literature even entire coprocessors dedicated to just tracking the mutation and modification of data that is non-deterministic or like runtime determined, I guess, is another way of putting it, dynamic data. Then another big one that is in the history which brought me into this whole mess was business team said, hey, we want to do kernel protection. There's like hypervisor introspection, can we look into that? So I tried to effectively over the past 2-3 years implement a hypervisor introspection system and mitigate not only static data attacks, but then these data-only attacks on the kernel. And I messaged Case and the Linux security mailing list probably a couple months ago, kind of breathlessly, because I had just finished implementing a verifier for the file operations struct, as well as SU Linux ABC caches and some other key data structures. And I was super happy. I drank a lot of beer that night because I got it working, but the phone like took 15 minutes to boot and it was completely unusable. So that's my little spiel about hypervisor introspection. Then one of the interesting things that's happened over the past few months, if you've been looking at the LLVM mailing lists and also Apple's contributions to Clang and LLVM, is sort of a typed malloc or partitioned memory. And this idea goes all the way back to the 80s. I'm blanking on the name of the very smart person that talked about typed memory allocations back in the 80s. But the other very popular system that does this, which you may know of, and I think I have a typo of the name, is SEL4, right, where they have a effectively linear allocation of each type of data in the operating system, and then that provides pretty strong guarantees for like just regular mutable data resources. And then some of the academic sort of forward-facing stuff on this is DARPA's Sherry Hybrid Capability C system, which is a freaking cool name, that looks at attaching automata models based upon sort of, I guess, C language annotations. So in this sense, you can look at mutable data, not at the layer of just memory corruption exploits or leveraging use after freeze, but actually as automata models of, say, network protocols and things like that. I apologize if I'm going through these things quickly, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page of everything that's been done so we can have productive discussion. So this is actually the last slide. So then we have the recent posts to the mailing list for ARM permission overlay extension, which very closely, if you paid attention to Samsung's RKP back in 2014, is really a ring-based privilege, a sort of domain isolation system for key kernel data structures. patch submitted to the mailing list by Kevin Brodsky earlier this year is a POE domain for the page table infrastructure, which I actually think is a very good first start. One of the problems that I ran into when I was implementing this I guess it's 2.5 years ago now, was I was really afraid about the idea that you could switch into the privileged domain in the sense that you could corrupt data being passed to the privileged domain. For example, in Android, we also use EROFS because because compression is important for saving on space. So EROFS, if you know, has its own page map data structure that determines the mappings from virtual to physical memory. So even with ARM POE or, say, some of the other people's implementations of privilege ring-based domain systems, it doesn't really solve exploits. That's not to say that it couldn't solve exploits. I think POE is an important first step, and it actually works, which is important, and it's more than I can say about a lot of my code. Then some of the interesting stuff we saw earlier today, AVF and PKVM, so some of the stuff that Google is working on. I am super hopeful for virtualization-based isolation of specific drivers and components. As you know, on Android, we have dev KGSL, the Adreno GPU driver. I mean, it's not all Android devices, but that's global, ioctl from unprivileged applications because we all like video games. And I think that there is potential for VM-based isolation of specific GPU operations or specific device driver operations and proprietary drivers. I can see that being a win. I worry with some of the work that I've seen out of companies that will not be named, that this will simply push the threat surface back to the SMC layer, like SMC IDs and the hypervisor layer, by extending the capabilities of the hypervisor. So something there. Then, of course, there's the actually very good idea to rewrite parts of the kernel in a language different than C because of ownership and lifetime. Of course, this will not handle the people aimbotting Counter-Strike 2 using specialized $700 DMA devices. And then we still have certain proprietary non-free drivers, of which I may be a code reviewer for, so that tells you that much, which are certainly written in C. And one of the very important things about the kernel self-protection project, at least to me, is that it's kind of a kernel self-protection project. It's kernel versus a lot of binary object files that may be written in any language. Then another thing that came up when I was talking to Kevin Brodsky about this was defensive reprogramming. So I mentioned the hypervisor introspection framework that I tried to work on initially. And one of the things I ran into very quickly was issues in Snapdragon SoC's interrupt handler for permission faults because of compare and exchange atomic instructions. So if you know the struct file pretty personally, then you know there's a file lock field. And if you're dealing with very frequent updates to a data structure that may or may not be sensitive, then you'll run into issues with performance and then just honestly hardware support when trying to protect the parts of that structure which are sensitive, such as file function pointers and things like that. But I think that there is a very good route towards trying to look at splitting out sensitive data from certain structs into separate structured definitions, kind of a very straightforward changes to the code of the kernel. And then last I should mention this because I worked with Kira Wong this past summer. She looked at a bunch of recent Android malware, both sophisticated and unsophisticated, and got a lot of traction and distance out of just basic audit logging. So just looking at using the literal audit system within Linux and then also just checking dmessage logs. So I felt like I should mention that as well. Okay. Yes, that was a lot of information, but I did it because we only ate up 15 minutes. And I wanted to save the other 15 minutes for discussion between all of you. So I see we already have a hand. And on my way to transfer the first microphone over, I'll give you my personal opinion on it, which is over the past few months, I've been looking as well at Clang plugins for tracking essentially the integrity of mutable data And I actually love the LLVM plugin system a lot. I think Apple's already done a lot of work on debug locations and DI locations in general, and you can get a very fine-grained analysis of data structures at the compiler layer, and then essentially from there generate a set of header files that can be loaded by a early boot kernel module to track data structure allocations. That was a mouthful. It kind of goes back to this idea of typed malloc. I do believe that personally, that is a very legitimate and good way forward, simply because the other options, such as a ring-based isolation system, or a hypervisor-based isolation system, or memory tagging and tracking via hardware, have certain drawbacks. And if we can begin to instrument these data structures at the compiler layer via plugins or other means, then it won't solve all cases. It won't handle pointer aliasing, but it does seem to be a very quick and easy way to coordinate with these other systems on protecting these sensitive fields of these data structures. So that's my personal opinion and what I would like to see for the future of Linux. And I will be sending code to the mailing list in the next few months to do so. And I've already got some snippets on the LLVM form that you can look into. But that's something I hope to see, and I'm actually really enthused to see Case's initial talks on this and talk about compiler support, because it seems like the future might be very bright for preventing these attacks. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. We had opinion in the back, or a question, or just anything.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm a little surprised that you think that the compiler is the best alternative, like given your reluctancy this morning about changing the compiler, you know what you told Case about the problems with the licensing and stuff. But I mean, I understand what you mean about the drawbacks, because what I wanted to say is that the idea of using VM isolation for the drivers, that's crazy. I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, but doesn't that go against the philosophy of, you know, monolithic kernels? Performance-wise, is terrible. Like, could you tell me, like, I struggle to see the benefits of something like that.
Yeah, so that's sort of two questions in one. The first is with respect to licensing. So I'll tell you my personal experience, right? As I wrote this Clang plugin, I realized it was proprietary, and then I was like, okay, I got two options here, right? I told my Annika, the love of my life, I told her dad, I was like, if you write compiler plugins, you can make a lot of money. And then the other half of me is like, I just need to probably share this code so that generally the world can benefit, mirroring what Case said earlier. So I do think licensing, at least from a developer's perspective, is something that definitely causes conflict. I'm trying to push Motorola in a direction to make things more open, but I think it is always a push with the business sides to make that possible. And then the second is, you push back on my VM isolation idea, and I agree. Yeah, I think it's hard. I think it's really, really difficult. And I think it does also kind of go against the idea of writing a monolithic kernel.
But what about, so you mentioned Android, like, I know that some people are using like hypervisors for phones, when in that sense, like, maybe in that scenario, it makes a little bit more sense than for Linux in general. What do you think?
Yes, because in Android, the kernel module ecosystem is relatively fixed. And you see arguments about this going back to 2014, where you can do a lot better integrity checking of kernel modules because you are only expecting to load a very specific set of kernel modules. Now, why I think kernel, sort of a VM or some method of virtualization-based isolation between certain device layers within Linux or other layers in Linux is good is because if you can make it performant, and I believe that there's a route to make it performant, then if you corrupt a GPU driver, it doesn't give you access to the world, right? So we saw Adreno GPU exploits literally last month, or was it this month? Memory is escaping me, where essentially you can corrupt the objects within the GPU driver. If there's a way that we can isolate that and sandbox it into a system where even if there's a bug in a GPU driver or a proprietary driver, it doesn't threaten Linux or the free parts of Linux, that could be a win. But I don't think it's an easy route at all. I think it's a route worth exploring.
I'm happy to give the microphone to someone else.
Yes, I also have another microphone up here.
Yeah, just some thoughts based on everything that got discussed here, but like a lot of, I would classify a lot of this as attack surface reduction in a big way. Like if you're looking at data-only attacks, say, well, if I can attack less of it out of those 20,000 structures, if I can have fewer of them that are writable, you know, there's a win. And to that end, like you've already talked about it, the ARM PoE and there's the Intel protection keys. Those things do get us closer to making things not writable when they're just living in the system. You know, unless you're actively running a portion of, you know, of code that is saying I need to update page tables, only that code is able to touch that stuff. So I think there's quite an avenue forward on that. Like at least Intel x86 CPUs and ARM CPUs have compatible ideas about how to do this protection key style of operations. It sort of reminds me of, you know, the success we had with, you know, non-executable memory. There was a big transition when people went, wait, you mean I can't execute it, but I can read it? That was a big transition, and I think we're going to have a similar thing happening with the protection key style stuff, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out how to move the locks further away, we're going to have to change how we've laid out stuff in the kernel, I think, to take advantage of that. And then my last thought was, like, there's sort of, I think with any mitigation, we have to weigh how difficult is it for us to protect the target versus protecting against the root cause. And I think as the low-hanging fruit, we're now starting to jump up to grab some of the low-hanging fruit in the kernel and the tool chain. And now it seems like, okay, maybe we really do need to solve the 50-year-old problem of C and having, you know, having all the types wrap around and, you know, all these like really fundamental root cause problems. It's like, okay, maybe we have to tackle that so that we don't have the flaw to begin with. So I think it's weighing what's possible, how long it'll take, stuff like that. I don't know. Those are just thoughts.
It's all Ken and Dennis's fault, really. I think that I agree. And one thing that's come up for me in trying to address this, which you reminded me of through your comments, was I mentioned, for example, the elliptic curve constants on a prior slide, which is, now, given the cryptographic constant initialization case it's actually a bad example because it's a very fixed value. You know that at kind of boot time what those constants should be. But there's other cases where you might slightly, K worker queues, right? So K worker queues, there's wonderful exploits where you write to a global K worker queue, call user mode exec helper, because it has the same CFI tag as other K worker queue objects. So that's a case where you kind of have something, at least as far as CFI is concerned, which is valid, being written to a piece of mutable data in the kernel. And it places the kernel in a position, and admittedly, I would not say this is a low-hanging fruit. I would say this is a high-hanging fruit, which is trying to determine at a semantic level what a change to a piece of data that is expected to change is, whether that change is correct or not. So that's something that keeps me up at night as well. This is one of the reasons why, in terms of compiler instrumentation, I've been looking back at ideas like heap canaries and things like that, which are well-trodden soil, because I feel as though there's a way that you can pass a secret which is known only to correct code or non-malicious code through the system, which makes it more difficult for malicious code to modify these pieces of mutable data. Essentially, the same victories that we had with canaries in the past and with ASLR and sort of these other things is keeping something that the attacker doesn't know. So I do have a couple points here. So it's not just opinions, but additional ideas, things that people know of that I've not mentioned. Was I comprehensive in this list? Maybe? I think the field's still really young. We've been like, the 70s wasn't very long ago. So I think there's probably, I hope that everyone here goes back home tonight and thinks about this a little bit more, because there's probably more we could do. I have a feeling. And then we've talked a little bit about feasibility. I think both the comments prior talked a little bit about feasibility. I'm wondering if anyone in the audience knows or has a strong opinion regarding the feasibility of a specific approach. It sounds like we've kind of decided the chipset manufacturers, or really the standardization communities for the ISAs, will determine a lot of the feasibility here. What do you think?
So things like control flow integrity, like I think you mentioned, it's feasible, but I think there's a bit of a friction between like the performance and the security, and I would say that's one of the hardest parts of your endeavor, is like trying to find that balance.
It's not my endeavor, by the way. I care about this very deeply, but I think it's our endeavor.
Okay, sir.
Really, it's I think that, and speaking towards the performance things, yeah, I see, at least practically in my work, I see essentially, at the end of the day, there's got to be a bunch of switches that somebody turns on if they care about this stuff and if they're under threat. We see that with Google's lockdown mode, which is sort of mirroring similar functions on Apple. Of course, the giants have come to sort of the same conclusions, which is a good step in this direction as well, which is just like pull all the stuff out of the system and lock it down. So I certainly don't want to distract as well from those higher level concerns as well. Just basic like, oh, this file in the file system is readable and writable.
I don't know if this is a new thought, but you were talking about the being able to extract sort of semantic information at assignment time. Like, is this a good pointer to write here? Like, we've done this for, is this a good pointer that we should call to with the CFI pieces? So maybe we need to pull that back even further and say, oh, great, now we actually have to instrument writes and say, are these writes to these sensitive things valid? Are they part of what we'd expect to be here, or stuff like that, which I cannot imagine what the feasibility of that looks like, the performance hits on that. Right, the question is static or runtime. It's like, I don't know, you'd probably have a static list that maybe was generated at boot or something, but you'd have to check it at runtime. And like my first idea in here, just as a total joke, please understand, a joke was, well, we just hook up the LLMs to learn what, for every write, we'll do a full LLM search, and it'll be great. The hardware and chipset manufacturers will love us. But like a CFI, but sort of like an assignment integrity checker, which again, this cannot possibly be a new idea, but I wonder where that kind of research even is.
It holds a soft spot in my heart, because I think that when I messaged you about typed memory allocations, I linked some of the patches I had submitted over the past year, which ended up, they work in a prototype, and I'm working actually now to deal with stability and actually getting those out the door in this year's device models. But you'll see, if you look through some of those, doing the write-based verification, like at the time of write, actually requires us to really rethink the red-black tree organization of VMalloc and a lot of other stuff to get performance out of it. In particular, I'll mention, and I think I've mentioned this directly to a lot of people, is right, when you allocate a BPF program, and in Android, particularly a seccomp BPF program, it gets allocated adjacently to other data pages during VMalloc. That makes per write integrity checking of page table updates possible in Snapdragon SoCs. So you actually, in order to get this working on Motorola phones, I had to essentially rework parts of vmalloc so that code pages were not intermingled next to data pages, so that I could enable the privilege execute never table bits in data page tables, so that I could essentially do verification of rights on page table entries. And I share that because if you're going to implement this on Snapdragon SoCs or other ARM SoCs, I think it might be valuable insight. But I think the reason why I didn't follow up on those patches, and I was just like, okay, I'll just hack these in at a runtime, was that I was like, is the kernel ever going to want to change vmalloc.c? And maybe it's my fault because I'm not a solid enough programmer, but also I don't even necessarily want to change vmalloc.c for everything. So I don't know. I think we have to ask some really hard questions about parts of the kernel that are not even related to security to begin to do instrumentation of rights just at a practical layer. And especially if you are like me and you're like, I just want to get something working like tomorrow. Yeah, so just a little bit of a side.
I mean, the address sanitizer has already done all the work of hooking all this, this is where a write occurs. So, it's just a modification to the sanitizer. But I mean, it was a lot of work originally with KSAN to actually be able to hook all the places where things are being stored. So that sort of harder, nitty-gritty, low-level stuff is solved. But the like actually determining, like you were saying, semantically what's allowed here, that piece needs the research.
If I can just give a quick bit of interesting, it's completely, well, it's related insofar as even the assembler doesn't support these things, right? So I included on my slide earlier, right? Like, in order to check the system control register updates inside EL2 on ARM SoCs, you have to write raw bytes because the assembler that's included with, I guess it's probably just the GNU assembler, doesn't understand the sctlr EL12 move like MSR instructions. So there's work at kind of all levels to make this a reality. The other neat aside is that you can look in anybody's hypervisor for this byte sequence, right? Replace the star with a 1 or a 2 and see whether they're actually checking TVM bit updates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm huge on Rust, so I agree with you about what you said about rewriting other languages, but that's exactly one of the things about Rust. Like, sometimes you have to use assembly because you don't even have like the bytecodes like being able to be translated.
Yeah.
Like, you have to write that unsafe code, like the one you were talking about, because they don't even have the instructions. Even in Rust, you have to go ahead and do it in, raw. So.
I check on time. Oh, well, I don't know if I think I already went over time, maybe even. But is that true? I think so. Is that 4:15? Okay, yeah, I should get off. Yeah, we should talk more offline because new languages, I think that there's still challenges. I mentioned DMA devices and things like that. So not necessarily like Steam OS, if you think of Linux, right? If you want people to not hack your games, then there's interesting problems there. Okay, thank you, everyone. Yeah.